Welcome, welcome. Okay. So we'll just do some introductions while everyone keeps dropping in. This afternoon we are going to be talking about hierarchy of rodent control, and what we're going to cover today. Really, we'll start off with just a few introductions. There's quite a lot to go through in March, so that we've just got a few bits to highlight on things coming up, which are quite exciting. So what we're going to cover today, obviously we know about the hierarchy of rodent control and how it's all fallen into place with CRRU now and how that all works. So we're going to discuss that as we go through. We're going to look a bit about ERAs, environmental risk assessments, and try and sort of cover any misconceptions and things with that, and why it's important to get that sort of side of things right. Hopefully at the end we're going to have a chance for 5 or 10 minutes to have questions, so get them questions in. It's good to see with 250 of you joining now, and still a few still dropping in, which is good. Just to let you know, Natalie will be back on the 7th of April. She's going to be doing a webinar on trend analysis for EFK units, so don't miss that one. If you're not registered already, go in and register for that one. There will be one CPD point for today. When you register, it will ask you for your registration number. If you put it in, your points should be automatically added. If you're watching this after the fact, so you're not watching it live, you can add them points yourself. There is a chat section. I see some of you are dropping messages in there already. The weather isn't great around here, so if it's sunny where you are, that is fantastic. Use that chat section to talk amongst yourself. I can't see or hear you. So if you have any technical issues or anything, put it in the chat section, and Kat, who's sat in the background, will hopefully be able to help you out with that. If you do have a problem, sometimes it's just a case of turning it on, turning it off, and then turning it back on again. Get that the right way around, and that might sort the problem out. But Kat will be there to help with any of that. There is also a Q&A section. If you've got any questions, stick them in the Q&A section. I'm going to try and cover as much as I can. Obviously, we've only got an hour, so I'll try and fit it all in. But if you do have any questions, stick them in the bottom, and I'll hopefully be able to answer them at the end. Just a reminder about Pest. So less than 2 weeks now, March 16th, 17th, Pest is coming up. If you pre-register, there's a chance of winning a games console, a PlayStation 5. So drop in and pre-register in there. Like I say, myself and Natalie are going to be down there doing a talk as well. So pop in and see us. And we'll also be on the stand. Big news, you probably would have seen yesterday in the news bulletin. BPCA TV is going to be a new feature for 2022. The first show is on Wednesday, the 9th of March, with Natalie as a host, and there'll be 3 panelists on there having a discussion, talking all things rodents. 3 great panelists on there. I am really looking forward to that. I'll be hopefully watching. And it's a great opportunity. If you've got any questions around rodent control and things like that, be on that webinar, and hopefully they'll have time to answer your questions too. And last bit of news for March, it is Dementia UK is the BPCA Charity of the Year this year. So all the staff team in March will be walking 2,750 miles to raise money for the charity. So if you'd like to donate towards a great cause, that would be amazing. And normally when you log into the Zoom, it pops up in the background where you can donate. If not, there is some information on the website. So that is introductions done for today. Okay, let me start sharing this when it lets me click on it. Good. Okay, so we're going to talk about the hierarchy of rodent control today. Now, this is something we've done forever. I remember when I first started 11 years ago in pest control, it was something that was always talked about. And then it sort of developed more as CRRU came in around 2015. And we'll talk a bit more about that shortly. So the guidance now obviously sits with CRRU, and you'll see it on your product labels. You'll hear it talked about quite a lot. And obviously, with it being heavily involved with this, it will form part of today's presentation. And it's something that we'll sort of drop in and out as we go. But I've tried to cover everything around hierarchies today. So we'll drop in and around that sort of subject as we come to it. If you want more information about CRRU, there is a July 2021 edition, which is the new one. There is a book version, which I keep in my bag pretty much all the time now. And you can also download a version online through the thinkwildlife.org website, and the BPCA website has it in our code section. So I think from my experiences and the conversation I've had over the years, even before CRRU came in, we did a very good job of managing risk hierarchies and doing risk assessments on, pest locations and things like that. And as an industry, we do that very well. And we've always done these pest risk assessments. I remember when I first started, I was always taught that when you go into like a domestic property, you're always looking for that non-target risk. Looking for if they've got kids, if they've got pets, and what you're going to do to mitigate that, and how you're going to structure your control, obviously to protect them non-targets. And this is the sort of things we're going to be talking about today. Okay, so now with sort of more research that's been carried out and the change in product labels and things like that, we do have a bit more of a structured approach to rodent control. Mainly to protect non-targets such as people and other animals and non-target habitats. And this is where the sort of hierarchy came in. And with some things, you have to follow it. So like with mouse control, because field mice have now been removed from the product label, you have to go through that step of trapping, finding out what species you're treating before you can use anything else. So in some situations, you do have to follow that procedure a little bit sort of more defined. But every site is completely different, and we will get that. We will get to that a little bit later on in the presentation. And like I say, with rats, it's slightly different. The identification can sometimes be a little bit easy, but it's still really important that we follow that hierarchy. And this is the subject that we're going to touch on today in the presentation. Next slide. There we go. So the agenda, we're going to look a bit about the history, kind of how we got to where we are now and how it all happened, and why it's important. We're going to look at why we need to control rodents, just a bit of a refresher on this. And we're going to look at the hierarchy of rodent control. Obviously, within that, you're going to have environmental risk assessments. We're going to touch a bit on rodenticides, mainly about the groups, not individual products. And we're going to talk a little bit about rodenticide resistance, how it happened, and what we need to do with it. So why do we have these sort of pieces of legislation and these hierarchies that we have to follow? Well, it demands from consumers for high quality food and safe food. We need high quality and safe food. There's lots of new legislation around food, the production of food and how it is handled. And this has always been the case and will continue to be. As we develop, things change, new pieces of legislation come in around food. More recently, there's been a lot on like allergic responses and things, but that legislation is ever evolving. Now, with the high standards in the food industry, it's obvious that in the pest industry, we play a major part in that, in the sort of keeping food good quality and safe for human consumption. And this goes right through from processing sites right through to supermarkets. There are standards out there for food manufacturing, and some supermarkets have their own standards, which we have to follow to make sure that their production and safe food is guaranteed. We also need to have, highly efficient rodent control to prevent food damage and disease spread. And depending on where you read, it's somewhere between 14 and 20% of all food worldwide is damaged through rodents, whether that be through direct consumption, damage from droppings, hair, rodents that have been baked into products and things like that. There's loads of different ways that food can become contaminated or have issues with disease in the packaging or on the product. And this ranges right the way from farm right through to fork and everywhere in between. And also we've had changes in product regulations to better protect non-targets. So we need to look after our environment. Pest control is really important, and we need to make sure that people are obviously protected from disease, property damage, food damage, things like that. We also need to do this in a safe, efficient manner that also protects non-targets, whether them non-targets be humans or animals, and we also need to protect that environment as well. So this is why we have sort of these standards have come in. So CRRU is obviously the standard that we use now. Is on just about all the product labels that I'm aware of. You'll see it mentioned quite a lot. And this is how it sort of came into place. It happened in 2015. So before 2015, the HSA had 2 information sheets, and that makes up a lot of what's in today's standard as well. So not a lot has changed. It's just been refined with things like product labels changing, and that's had an effect vice versa. So it's just come to the point where it is today. So in 2012, obviously the HSE had these documents, and stakeholders and other people were asked to come and comment on what information should be in this. So in 2012, the document was drafted up, and everyone had a chance to comment on that. And from that, in 2013, there was a meeting held with all the stakeholders, and this was to discuss the comments from 2012. And it was at this meeting that it was agreed that rodenticides needed a stewardship. And this covered the main rodenticide user groups, such as pest professionals, local authorities, farms, land management, and gamekeepers. Good. So that's how CRRU came about. And then in 2015, the stewardship was launched for the use of all rodenticides. And this is where it was then CRRU. We've used that moving forward. So why do we need to control rodents? There's a number of different reasons, but we've got things like disease spread. So hantavirus, leptospirosis, rat bite fever, salmonella from drains and dirty environments. They can spread that bacteria onto food and food contact surfaces. Hantavirus is something that when I first started, I'd never heard of it until like a few years into pest control. And that's normally in the drop-ins of mice. You pick that bacteria up, it gets into your lungs, and it affects your lungs. The big thing with hantavirus, when I actually read up on it probably about 6 or 7 years ago, was that the mortality rate from it was quite high. So if you clean up drop-ins and things, just make sure you're wearing the appropriate PPE for that. Leptospirosis or Wheels disease, it's passed in the urine of rats. Normally somewhere between 25 and 50% of a population can be infected with it. And you can get that through cuts, through your mucous membranes, such as your eyes, and you can ingest it if you don't wash your hands, things like that, before you eat. So disease spread is obviously a big one. You've got physical contamination. This can be from hair, feces, dropping. Even rodent bodies can be a problem. Like I say, I've seen things that have been baked into produce before when mice have got into the production line. So this can obviously all spoil food. Structural damage, this could be damage to water pipes, maybe subsidence, or issues with building materials. It could be electrical systems, so chewing electrical systems. I remember getting a call out to a car dealership one day where a rat had actually chewed through the wiring system of quite an expensive car there. So that they will chew through these electrical systems and cause quite a lot of damage. They can also block drains and sewers, and these can cause floods or backups where sewage water is coming out of people's gardens and things like that when they've collapsed the drainage system. So yeah, structural damage is a problem. Obviously, there's a risk to injury if you're working near cables. I was at a site the other day, and there was a box, and right next to that box, you could see where a rat had chewed through an electric cable that was running around the outside of the building. So if you touch that, obviously there's a chance there of an electrocution issue. Also, things like fires. If you've got rodents chewing cables in loft spaces, it could cause a fire, and you could be bitten by rodents. So there's that risk of injury from the rodents itself as well. Food spoilage, like I mentioned, damage to all sorts of food, whether it's just the packaging or the food inside, and that obviously then needs to be disposed of. And then we've got legislation reasons that makes it illegal to have pest activity in food sites. But also there's wider reaching legislation from that. Things like the Prevention of Damage by Pest Act that stipulates local authorities have a duty to keep their district free of rats and mice. So there's lots of legislation reasons why we need to control pests. And then compliance with standards. There are lots of different standards out there, whether it's BRC, ARB. Obviously, some supermarkets have their own standards as well. So we might need to meet them standards when we're controlling the pests on them sites. And that obviously then guarantees safe food production. So the end user knows that wherever they're buying their food from, it's been handled in a safe manner and it has met them standards. Okay. So integrated pest management. You'll see integrated pest management mentioned on product labels and things. Or it's sometimes called IPM. So what is it? Like I say, you're going to see this on product labels. And I was reading one yesterday when I was on a site and it was on there. It's basically integrated pest management. It's using a combination of techniques in an approach manner to control pest activity. So you're going to have proofing and housekeeping in there. You're going to have non-chemical controls and you're going to have chemical controls. So you're integrating different techniques that focus on pest prevention, pest reduction, and then obviously eliminating conditions that allowed that infestation in the first place. And it's rare that just by doing one of these, so if you're just doing proofing, it's rare that that's going to solve the problem completely. So you normally have a combination of these together while you're doing your treatments. And it's different for every site as well. So take, for instance, if you're controlling rats in a barn, shooting might be appropriate in that barn setting, as long as there's no asbestos paneling, or something used to come across quite regular. But shooting might be appropriate. But then for other places, it won't be. So if you went into like a domestic kitchen, then shooting wouldn't be appropriate for that domestic kitchen. So every situation is going to have a unique combination that you're going to use from these sort of three approaches. And you're going to use them all together to deal with that pest issue if it is appropriate. Then to expand on this further, we also have the risk hierarchy, which then gives us a bit more guidance on using these techniques to best protect non-targets. And the risk hierarchy also means that rodenticides are protected so that we can use them in the future. If we follow the risk hierarchy, we use these products in a safe and effective way, we'll keep them. So what is the risk hierarchy? Basically, it's doing a treatment in a structured way to protect non-targets, but also deal with a problem. So like I said, this will be very much site specific. Some control techniques will be appropriate, some won't. And for each site, you'll carry out this risk hierarchy. It will be unique. It will follow the same principles, but like I say, you'll have your unique pieces in there for the site you are working on. So when we look at it, environmental controls, it's good to get them done first. If you're removing housekeeping and proofing, and you're doing that early on, you can remove competing food sources and things like that. Physical controls, obviously safest for non-targets, and for like cost regulations and things, it is safer for you to do them. So they would be your next group. And then your pesticides are in there as well. Like I say, some things will be appropriate for the site you're working on, some won't. So every job will be individual. Now, the following slides on from this are in no particular order. It's just how I put them in. Like I say, it's very much site specific. And it boils down to dealing with that pest issue quickly. So the idea is to achieve control quickly, but do it in a safe and effective way that also protects the environment and non-target species. And like I said, this will protect the future of rodenticides as well. So surveys are really important. And, surveys are the starting point of your control. And it's good to get this correct and get the correct identification when you carry out your survey of the pest species you're going to be treating. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. So what you're going to be looking for, entry points. I've just picked a few out of the forever list that you could come up with. I just wanted to cover the main ones. So entry points, looking for points of entry. This can be above or below ground. That 360 pest control look everywhere, looking roof voids, looking void cupboards, underfloor void spaces. Just make sure that you rule out every possibility. Food location and harborage locations. This will then give you your travel routes. So them three things work together to give you your travel routes. You're going to find obviously the food location so you can remove it, and a harborage location as to where they will be. Normally it can be quite difficult to get to harborage locations. I think I've only ever seen a few, especially rat nests. Mice I've seen quite a few, but not so many rats. They're normally somewhere that's a little bit out of the way and tricky to get to. But knowing where that harborage location will obviously give you them travel routes, and that'll better allow you to establish rodent control points on them travel routes. Okay. Don't forget to look at pest control folders if you're on a site and it's a new site to you, or you're looking after a site that someone else has been on. Have a look in that folder. It may give you some ideas if you've had a problem before, where that problem's been, and things like resistance. If they've used a product before that's not worked, that may give you an idea of resistance that may be on the site. So you're going to gain a lot of information from your survey, and this will influence the treatment. And the majority of reasons that I've seen treatments, being delayed in how quickly they've achieved control is normally because something's missed at this survey stage. And once you gather all this information, you'll have a good idea then of areas that need proofing and areas that you can look at to place control points. And this is the start of your foundation of your treatment. Okay, within this, you're going to look at environmental risk assessments. Like I said at the start, we carry out these risk assessments all the time, and they've always been there. And there has been some confusion around ERAs in more recent years. But what we're going to look at with environmental risk assessments, when you're looking at the CRRU document, it has a list in there of things that we should look at, and this is from that list. So aims of the treatment, what are your aims for this treatment? You need to look at the risks and non-targets. So looking for them non-targets, non-target habitats. Are you near water? Is there an overgrown area nearby? Kids, children, do pets have access to it? Is it on the edge of a main walk through maybe? So looking for these sort of non-target risks. Stopping exposure to non-targets, how best we do that. And this comes down to as well, using traps in boxes, not using bait if non-targets can have access to it, and that sort of thing. But also know the area you're working in. So if you're in sort of North Leeds, or there's an area of Wales where there's a high population of red kites, these obviously feed on dead animals. So you need to know about not only the area, but also what's in the wider area for when you're controlling them. And if you've worked in the area, you'll know your sort of your sort of back garden, as it were, and you'll be able to work out if it's safe to do what treatment in that area. Okay, how you dispose of rodents? So it's been a big discussion over recent years on disposing of rodent carcasses. It will say on majority of product labels, especially the ones that I've read, it will say, it'll give you a way of disposing of rodents. So make sure you are following that. There is a lot of work going on at the minute around disposing of rodent carcasses and things. So hopefully there will be an update coming on that in the coming months. Follow-up procedures. So as I mentioned, follow-ups, how often will you carry out follow-ups? Will you need to do them more often because of something that is nearby? Is there an agreement with a customer where they may want them on a certain time frame? Obviously, if you feel like you should do more, then more is better than less. But the customer might say, we want follow-ups every day internally, just so they can keep on top of that problem as well. And then you're going to look at prevention of reinfestation. So methods to prevent that reinfestation in the future. How can you leave that site when the treatment is completed to reduce the risk of the infestation? It's prevention is better than cure. If you can prevent it, that is good to prevent it happening again. And we do these things all the time when we're carrying out treatments, not just external treatments, but internal treatments as well. And it's important that you document this in information. So these are the steps that you're going to look at when you're carrying out your environmental risk assessment. It's important once you've got an outcome from it that you document that in your report. It doesn't have to be war and peace, but just make a record that you've looked at these things and you document that in your report as well. And don't forget in your report, put in additional housekeeping and proofing. So if the site need to carry out proofing and housekeeping, give them that information as well. It may be they want you to do the proofing work if they don't have someone on site to do it, but give them the information so that they know what they need to do on their side to help control the problem. If you're at PestX, like I say, we will be doing a talk on environmental risk assessment, so come along to that. It will be great to see you there. Okay, pest identification. This is obviously really important. If we can identify the pests that we are treating, you know what control method you're going to be able to use, and it will help better structure your treatment. So rats, got the brown rat and the black rat. The black rat, longer tail, is a bit more slender, larger ears, normally living up in roof spaces, and they're mainly found in port areas. And I think there's some islands in Scotland that have infestations of black rats. I did see one that someone had caught up in Scotland, a black rat. It's the only one I've ever seen that was actually been caught somewhere. And then you've got the brown rat. Color can sometimes vary between brown right the way through to sort of grays and dark grays. So yeah, identification on that is key. You've then got field mice and house mice. So your field mice are normally a sort of brown gingery in color, but they will always have like a pure white belly. You can get a yellow-necked mouse, which has a yellow neck, very similar characteristics. And the tail length is slightly longer with the field mouse. And then your house mouse, these are normally a little bit grayer, so they tend to be a little bit more gray in color, can be sort of reddish color as well, or brown, but they normally have like a gray belly. Tail's around 80% of head and body, but that gray belly color, they look at like a dirty mouse basically, and that's a good way to remember the difference. Field mice, pure white belly; house mice, be sort of grayer and dirtier in color. So identification is key, and getting that identification correct will help guide how you structure your treatments. Proofing. So proofing is obviously a big part. This will stop rodents getting entry to where you don't want them, and it will also help you control the rodents as well. Now, depending on the treatment you're doing, depends on you when you carry out your proofing. So some proofing it's appropriate to do at the start. If you want to stop them getting into a building, say, carrying out the proofing work will stop that problem getting into the building. Some you will do during the treatment. So it might be that you're carrying out a treatment in a warehouse and then you find that they're getting access into the bakery. So you might want to stop them gaining access to that bakery by proofing off that sort of section during the treatment. And as long as you're not forcing them somewhere else, you can do that as you go through. It's ever evolving and ever learning. And if you maybe didn't see it at the start, it may be something that you need to do as you go through that treatment. And then proofing work at the end. So a good example of proofing work at the end is if you've got like a hole in the wall, say in a warehouse where mice are coming out of, you might leave that hole open so that you can put maybe a bit of funneling in front of it and put some traps there so that you can use it as a control location. Once the treatment's done and you've got rid of them mice, you'd then seal off that hole just to stop it being used as an access point in the future. And the reason you do it that way, if you sealed it off at the start, it may be that you just force them rodents to another part of the building and you may end up just spreading the issue. So proofing, and then What materials are we going to use? I've always recommended using the most permanent proofing materials you can. So things like metal plates and cements work really well. Using products like foam, obviously they can just chew back through that. The only time I've ever seen foam used where it was actually quite efficient was in like a big expansion joint. They filled the expansion joint with foam, and then you could see where the mice were actually coming through underneath that expansion joint, and that narrows down your location of where you need to carry out your treatment. And normally when you fill expansion joints, you put like a rubber sealant on the top of them. You normally back that with foam anyway. So as long as site are happy for you to do that, it's a good place to use foam, but it's not a proofing technique. It's more of just a reduction while you're carrying out that treatment. Okay, so it's proofing. Habitat management. So removing one or more of the factors required by rodents to survive will obviously just make them not want to be there. It'll make it a sort of uninhabitable area. Denying that access to food and water is going to be key. Like I say, harbour bridges are normally quite hard to access sometimes, and it may not be that you can get into there. So like I say, removing these will make it unattractive to rodents. This will be easier on some sites than others, obviously. Removing food from like a big grain silo might be difficult, but there may be a way of restricting access. And I have seen them before where they've put like boarding around it just to sort of funnel them away from that food source. So if you can't remove it, restrict it, that will help. Big thing about removing the competing food sources, they're more likely to find your traps and your bait if you're using it quicker. So remove them competing food sources will hopefully mean that you get on top of that control a lot faster as well. So we talk about removal of harbourage and housekeeping. Obviously, just mentioned food and water on the last one. This I thought was quite a good one to cover on its own for harbourage and housekeeping. So debris, old building materials and things, make sure you're removing them. If rats are living in them and that's their harbourage site, you'd obviously leave that in place. With rats suffering from neophobia, if you was to remove that building material, you may just force the problem somewhere else. So with rats, leave the harbourage in place until you finish the control and then remove the debris afterwards. So like removing rubbish, old machinery. I've seen mice that have been nesting in the top of old fridges and things. There's normally some sort of insulation in there and they will get in there and create a nest. Vegetation, obviously that gives them nice cover. If you can remove the vegetation, you can remove that security, and it may not be appropriate to remove all the vegetation. So you might have to create like a channel or a footpath around the building just to give you that separation gap and give you an ability to walk around and look at, if you need to put any control points in that area or if there's any sort of proofing work that's been hidden by that vegetation that you can then carry out once that vegetation's been cleared. And don't forget things like good stock rotation. I'll never forget when I went into a warehouse one day. They said they'd had a rodent issue for a little while. I went in to have a look at what was going on. Was looking through some stock, and there was an aisle of dog food. And when I went and had a look at the dog food, the packet at the back, there was a 15-kilo bag, was completely empty. But because they'd not rotated that stock for a few months, it had just been sat there unnoticed, and the rodents had been there and just emptied that bag of dog food. And don't forget about inspecting goods in. A lot of the stuff that goes to shops now will come from a warehouse or some sort of holding facility. It's transported on trucks before it actually arrives at that outlet. It may be that the rodent problem is somewhere else, but is being delivered to the site. So inspecting them goods in will give you an indication of where they're coming from. I got a call out a few years ago for mice in a shop, and they were actually in boxes of rice. So it was kind of clear that they'd been there for a while. There's a nest there with some young in, and that had been brought in from a warehousing facility. So make sure you inspect them goods in. So trapping might form part of your treatment. Trapping is good because it retains the carcass. Obviously, there's no chemicals, so it's safer, or it's less risk than on targets. And using traps in boxes obviously then reduces the risk again. But it retains that carcass, so it'll prevent any bad smells, especially in sort of people's houses, office blocks, and places like that. So it is a good option. Like I say, it's non-chemical, so it's safer for non-targets. And there's obviously zero risk there of non-target poisoning. With traps, just be mindful where you are placing them. If you're working in places, that manufacture food, it may say on as you walk into that premise that, no nuts, for instance. So be careful what attractants you're using if you are on a site that has specific requirements. Just make sure you speak to them about trap attractants and what you can and can't use. And there is a real good spring traps code of best practice on the BPCA website that you can follow, and that covers, things like using traps as the manufacturers intended them to be used. Make sure that they're placed in funneling or boxes so that you can't, it's not going to get caught by its feet or its tail or anything. It's actually physically going to have to go onto that trap. So you funnel him onto it, as it were. Protect them from non-targets. Make sure the customer's aware of where you leave the traps. Placing traps where they're not going to go missing. You might have to tether them in place, maybe. Carrying out them regular inspections. If you leave a rodent on a trap for a long time, it will start to smell. So make sure you're carrying out regular inspections of them. Things like not setting traps in open areas. Obviously, if the member of public can get to it and they've put their hand on it, that might be a problem. And make sure you're wearing suitable PPE when you're handling traps. So, you're catching rodents on these, there can be bacteria on them. Make sure you're wearing the correct PPE for handling them traps. And then, if you want any more information on the code, it is available on the BPCA website. Like I say, that's just some of the things that it'll go through, but just to give you a bit of an update on that. For trapping. So trapping is part of the hierarchy that you're going to use. Then we talk about chemical controls. So I've put warfarin in there. There might be products out there that I'm not aware of. I couldn't see any when I had a look. But with warfarin, a bit like kumatetanol and cholecalciferol, they tend to come and go. New products come out, it may come back again. So I just included it in this as well, just to give you an update. So anticoagulants, these are your first gens, obviously warfarin and kumatetanol. And these are used against rats where there is not any resistance to anticoagulants. So warfarin came out in, I think, 1948 for rodent control. And in the early 50s, it was then used, obviously, in medicine to prevent things like heart attacks. And there was quite a bit of resistance to it, which is then why we moved on to the second gen. Now, when we talk about rodenticides, and as we go through these next few slides, obviously it's really important to read the product label with rodenticides. They can change from time to time. There are a few rodenticides that are going through relabeling at the minute. So keep an eye out for that if you get a new product over the next few months, that the labels have not changed. So read them product labels and understand them. Everything on that label is a legal requirement and you've got to follow it. If you're not sure of anything or you need additional information, don't forget to read the material safety data sheets or MSDS sheets. Normally find these from the distributors or manufacturers. And on them labels, you'll have 3 specific requirements. So you'll have indoors, in and around buildings, and open areas. Indoors is rats that are living and feeding indoors that don't have free access to outside. So they're living and feeding inside that building and they're not coming in and out from outside. You can use indoor only bait in that location. Then you've got in and around buildings. So that's the building itself, the area around the building that you're treating the building itself and the area around the building to treating infestations when rodents are moving into that building from outside. So, if they're coming through like a gap or somewhere like that and you need to control them outside, you can then use in and around buildings. And then open areas. Open areas is anywhere that's not associated with a building, basically. So if you're doing work that's not associated with a building, then open area products are what you're going to use. With first gens, there is less of them in the environment. There's only a few products that have them in, and they have a slightly higher LD50. So again, safer for non-targets, which is why they sit in this here. You've then got your second gens. So these are your multi-feeds. There are some resistance to these kicking around. I used to work in the Doncaster area for a little bit, and we used to have a little bit of problem with diphenicum from time to time. So these are going to be used against rats where there is no resistance to anticoagulants, and against rats that are carrying mutation L28Q and Y139S. You won't know what mutation they're carrying, but if you want to do tail sampling, there is the resistance action group that you can send tails off to, and they'll tell you if there's any problems with resistance in your area. Multi-feeds, they can take a lethal dose of multi-feed in a single day. They just need to feed on it a few times. If you remove all competing food sources and the only food they've got is, say, diphenicum, then they will feed on it, and they can take a lethal dose in a single day. With anticoagulants, there is a 3 to 10 day delay on how that rodent succumbs to that rodenticide. More dominant rodents or rodents that are squeezing through small gaps will obviously burst them capillaries sooner and succumb to it quicker. If you've got rats that are not squeezing through small gaps and not fighting, it can take slightly longer for it to take effect. Normally with multi-feeds, you use them in a saturation baiting program. Because they need to feed on multiple times, you need to make sure the bait is presented to them, and they can then feed on it to go through that multi-feed process to take a lethal dose before it will work. Then you've got your second generation single feeds. Again, Brodifacoum, diethylone, and fluclomifen. These for use against all mice and all rat strains. At the minute, I'm not aware of any resistance on these, which is why it's approved for all strains. Single feed, the only difference being that to multi-feed is they just need to eat less of it. It doesn't work any quicker or anything like that. They just need to eat less of it, as it were. Now, single feed can obviously be more toxic because it's got a lower LD50. So lower LD50, the more toxic the product. So you'd normally use this in like a pulse baiting technique where you'd put the bait down, allow it to run out before you put more bait down. That way the rodents that are fed off it will succumb to it, so that you're not just making them more and more toxic by just keep putting more and more bait down. So that is single feeds. Cholecalciferol, there's been a lot of talk about this over the last couple of years. Recommend against all rat and mouse strains. Again, make sure you follow legal requirements on the label for this product. There are things for like follow-up procedures, but also you need to make sure you're using the right amount of bait as to the product label, because that'll obviously it'll work if you use it properly. So make sure you're using that, following that product label. Alpha chlorelose, this is a narcotic. It's recommended for all strains of house mice. Alpha chlorelose is an acute poison, so it's an anesthetic. It slows down the heart and respiratory system, and the mice will die of hypothermia. Normally works really quick, within a few minutes, and the rodents are normally found either in or around the boxes. There is one drawback to acute poisons, and this is bait shyness. So a bit like if you was to go eat, a meal in a fish restaurant, you may get sick very quick from that. You're probably going to avoid eating in that restaurant again. So mice do this the same way with alpha chlorelose. If they eat it, they'll start to feel unwell. They may not eat enough to control them. So then they'll get better and they'll avoid eating it in the future. And it's not approved for rats. Rats' large body size means that they can regulate their body temperature slightly better. So yeah, it's not approved for rats. Or not any that I've seen are approved for rats anyway. It doesn't need to be cold either. It used to be that it had to be below a certain temperature. Now it's been found that it'll just about work anywhere. It doesn't have to be cold, as it were. There's then gases available. I've not used carbon dioxide before. I've seen the traps where they go in, the door shut, and it releases it. Aluminium phosphide is a product I've used quite a lot of, and then you've got hydrogen cyanide. Again, specific application. There's normally a training thing that you have to go through. So aluminium phosphide is a specific training course for that. Like I say, with all these, some will be applicable to where you're working, some won't. Obviously, you can't use gases anywhere near buildings. So yeah, or especially aluminium phosphide, you can't use near buildings anyway. So that's chemicals. Let's look a little bit about resistance, just keeping an eye on time. So how did resistance develop? Well, we've had very few active ingredients with many legal restrictions on how we use them. I think I only ever remember diethylene being out for a few years. Cholecalciferol was, I think, out before, it disappeared for a little bit and it's come back again. So yeah, there's not many active ingredients out there, and we're using them in the same manner with lots of legal restrictions on them. And like I say, there's this small amount of bait being presented in the same way. And that is developed the resistance. So how is it developed? You got two types of resistance. You got behavior resistance and physiological resistance. Behavior resistance is, for example, mice that will avoid eating a product. Take Birmingham area. Mice have developed a way of they won't eat carbohydrates basically, so they'll only eat protein-based food. And when I worked there, I remember that mayonnaise was always a really good attractant for traps in that area, just because it was high protein based. It's been going on for that long now that some mice have been found not to have an enzyme that breaks down carbohydrates, so they can't eat them at all. So yeah, behavior resistance is in there. And physiological resistance, if you put bait down in an area and you're using the same bait over and over again, that resistance, that bait will kill off the rodents that are susceptible to it, but it will leave the strain that is resistant. If that problem continues, that resistant strain will then breed, and that's how you have physiological resistance. So behavioral is behavioral. Physiological is where they can eat a toxic dose and it doesn't affect them, and that's done through breeding. Okay, glue boards, another option in your hierarchy. And like I say, none of this was in any order. It's just how I put it in when I made the presentation. It may be more appropriate to use glue boards on a site than rodenticides or vice versa. And you carrying out that site-specific survey and carrying out environmental risk assessments will indicate what you are going to use. So let's take, for instance, a food site. If you're working on a food site, you need to gain control quickly. You might put traps down. You may inspect them for a few days. If that isn't working, because you've got maybe a bit of trap shyness in there, then it may be appropriate to go to glue boards. It might not be appropriate to use rodenticides because that up to 10-day delay would obviously allow rodents to continue in that building. So yeah, every site is going to be completely different, and where you use these things obviously comes into your assessment of that site. So yeah, glue boards. Make sure you carry out a risk assessment, sorry to go back, including non-targets such as small birds and bats, it says there. Glue boards, obviously, we're only going to use them indoors, not outdoors, but just make sure you're carrying out that risk assessment. Things like pets and stuff, obviously, are going to be a problem. So look for non-targets that are going to be in that area. If you're going to use glue boards, make sure you follow the code of best practice. And it'll have all the points in there and what you need to do. And I just briefly pulled these off. So you've got to consider the risk hierarchy, got to be trained and competent to use them, got to carry out regular follow-ups, so not exceeding 12 hours. And your follow-ups, you can't give them to someone else to do. If you've put them down, you're responsible for them. But you do have to have a contingency plan in place. So if you're off for whatever reason, it may be that someone might have to, if you're off sick or whatever, someone might have to go back. So having that contingency plan in place if you are off is good. Make sure you use the correct size boards for what you're treating. Keep detailed record. Dispatch any rodents that you trap humanely. Make sure they are protected from non-targets. Remove the glue boards and make sure you dispose of them in a safe manner. So, making sure the glue boards are folded and bagged properly, and communicate with the customer. It is good practice if you are doing a glue board treatment to give them the code of best practice, and then they can see what their sort of side of it is that they need to follow as well. So make sure that communication is nice and clear with the customer. Obviously, they're going to have to let you back in to do the follow-ups. So make sure they're on board with that side. Good. How are we doing for time? Oh, Good. Any questions then? Let me just stop sharing this. Give me a second. Okay, questions. I'm running out of water. Mint, bring back Natalie. She's back next month from Anonymous. Okay. Our technicians have found that when we use second generation bait, after the initial use of first generation bait of population reduction, the poison rodenticides become disorientated and move erratically around a client human spaces in daylight. This is a concern according to IPM guidelines. Actions, their holds are achieved or thresholds are achieved when only one rodent is seen. How can we prevent this occurrence? How can you prevent rodents being poisoned and moving around? Use traps. Maybe if they're getting into an area that you could prevent, so like proofing it off, um, to prevent them coming out of that location. If you can control them somewhere in another part of the building and then proof it off so they can't get into that area, maybe that would stop them. But yeah, if you're using rodenticides, unfortunately, you're going to have to manage where they get into when they've been poisoned. Yeah, anyone had so tail sampling to check for resistance. I don't think they've heard anything back from the sampling. I know it was shut for a little bit because of COVID. It may be that you need to just get in touch with them and they will be able to help you with that. So, environmental risk assessments. ERA is the most important piece of info that we produce, but I still find it difficult to fill these in. Are there any examples anywhere that we can see how they are being used? If you go on the Think Wildlife website, they will have a ERA form, and basically, if you fill that form in, it'll get to a point where you'll go through all the bits and it'll say, if you've got to this section, don't continue the form in. So that'll guide you through your ERA onto what you can do and how you need to fill it in. If you get down a certain path, it won't let you fill the form in any further. If you go down another treatment route, you can then fill in the whole form. So there is a form on that, on the ERAs from CRRU. Is it possible that the picture you showed for Rattus was actually Rattus nivedicus? No, I'm pretty sure it was a brown rat in that picture. And the black rat was a black rat. Tail length is the kind of giveaway on that. Brown rat's normally around 80%, black rat's 100% plus. They have quite a long tail and it's quite noticeable. What happens if the company attending is paperless and therefore no folder will be presented on site? If they are paperless, they should still have reports. So if you go to a site and you're filling out digital reports, the site should still have a copy of them reports. They need that for things like products you've used and that information. So they should have a copy of the reports. If not, speak to the site and ask them just to get a copy of the reports. They should, they will have copies of reports. So yeah, they should be able to get them. How often do you have to check traps? Good question. You have to check them regular. I'd probably say no longer than a week. I did have a look at this the other day for fen traps, I think, and I couldn't see anything that give you a defining date. But yeah, check them regular. Don't leave it too long between checking them. If you leave it too long, you'll just end up with a really bad smell and rodents stick into traps, and it's not good. But yeah. Just mentioned that one. Um, I find field mice a couple of miles inside a city and house mice out in the country. Do all mice just need to be trapped first, please, to be sure of the target species? I can't think of another way to identify the species that you're treating unless you trap one first. I've worked in cities and found field mice before. And I used to live on a farm and I used to get house mice there. So I can't think of another way that you're going to be able to identify them that's reliable anyway. So trapping first before you use poisons would be the way to go. Why is alpha chlorellose approved for field mice inside as they die close to the bait? And it is a first generation bait, so no secondary poisoning. Why is it approved for field mice inside? Don't know why it's approved for inside only. There may be a reason for it. Probably, if they are dying and like if rats are eating rodenticides, they could maybe get back to a harborage and die there. If they're dying near the box, it may not be appropriate for them to just go feed in the box and then die outside the box, and the rodent is definitely going to be nearby. It's probably why it's only approved for indoors, but other than that, not sure. Can you explain carbon dioxide for rodent control? Not something I've ever used. I've only ever picked a few boxes up that I know that had it inside because it has a little carbon dioxide canister. So not something I've used a lot of. If you go online and just search carbon dioxide for rodent control, it will probably bring you some bits up. There is one company that manufacture traps that have a carbon dioxide system in them, and you'll be able to find that on there. Have a read through. I think there's some information videos on that as well for carbon dioxide in rodent control. Pulse baiting in a car park says you have 20 boxes down. Would you wait for all 20 baits to be empty before rebaiting when it is just each bait box, or when it is just each bait box? Allow that rodenticide to run out. Yes, if you've got bait boxes out and they're only eating, if you've got 20 boxes in a car park and they're only eating from one bait box, probably the chances are that if they're 10 meters apart, they're only going to be using that one bait box. Allow that to run out before you replenish it. Probably would be a good idea if they are just feeding out of one and you're getting no activity in the boxes to put all the other boxes onto maybe traps. Something is there in case something does go in there, but if they're not using them, remove that rodenticide. It may be that you might just end up getting mice on it anyway. But if the rats are feeding off one box, let it run out and then put more down when you need to. It's the time period more than anything. So allow them rodents to succumb to that single feed bait. And then once it's come to it, you can then put more down. So not putting more bait down for that period of maybe 10 days or whatever. Still do your regular follow-ups. Just don't put the bait down until you know them rats have succumbed to it. Is cost either directly or in time of manpower a justifiable excuse in that hierarchy when deciding to use external rodenticides in preference to traps first without actually demonstrating traps are ineffective? Without demonstrating traps are ineffective. Cost is what you cost your job at. Charge what you need to do the job properly. It's probably what I'm going to say on that one. Is it just a viable excuse? No. I can't see it being a justifiable excuse. Don't like taking statements on things like that, but I have on that one. Okay. Disease caused from inhalation, dust from rodent droppings. Hantavirus. Go and have a look on the internet at hantavirus. I don't always believe everything I read on the internet, but that is just a really interesting thing. when you type it in, it might come up in, I think there's like a lot of stuff in Spain, I think was the first thing that came up when I first looked at it a few years ago, and I looked at it again the other day. Basically, it's in the drop-ins. Once they dry, that dust is then, you're able, once you're sweeping it up and stuff, you can disturb it. You can inhale that, it gets into your lungs. And I think the mortality rate was something like 40% for hantavirus. It's quite a bad thing for your lungs. And I know when I was doing pest control, I always used to wear a face mask when I was doing any sort of rodents clean and stuff like that. So just make sure you're wearing the appropriate PPE when you're doing them rodent cleans. What if customers go paperless? Again, covered that. They should have reports. Every site you go to should have reports from previous jobs. So ask them for them. If they don't have access, they should be able to contact the company that is been there previously and get the reports for them. They need to have reports for, like I say, products that they've used, things like that. But also, if someone comes and does a survey like the HO, they'll want them reports as well. Glue boards being inhumane for rodent control. Which one? Are they inhumane? I don't know what to say on this. They have a place in what you need to use them for. Anything could be seen as inhumane. It depends on who's looking at it. If they're used properly, I don't feel like there is so much of a problem. But if they're used incorrectly, then yes, they could be classed as inhumane. What's BPCA stand on it? BPCA stand on this? Probably not going to answer that. I'll cop out of that one, unfortunately. If rats are already in a domestic property, proof them first is not effective. Nerphobia can prevent efficiency of traps. So it's okay to go straight to single feeds. If you're already in a domestic property, proof in first is not effective. If you're in a domestic property, finding root cause. If you know where the root cause is, you can then stop them at that source. Traps, you can have trap shiners just about anywhere. But I'd still say they are a good tool to use. Thing with traps, there's no resistance to it. So if you're in an area that might have resistance, traps obviously are going to work. Can you go straight to single feeds? Depends on the site you're working, depends on the situation you're in, depends on the products that you're using. But I'd always try and go, least non-toxic to non-targets first. And if that don't work, move your way through the hierarchy as you go. I could probably count in two hands how many times I've had to use single feeds to control a rodent population. And I've worked in quite a lot of areas that have had problems with resistance. So, yeah. Must remember to click on these that I've answered them. Disposal of dead rats. Can you explain more about it? Basically, on the product label, it will say dispose of it via your waste carrier, or use a incinerator. Some pet cemeteries, things like that, will take dead rodents. We're doing some work at the minute just to try and make it a little bit easier for pest controllers. Not sure what that is going to look like at the minute, but as soon as we know more, we'll be able to sort of give some more information on that. But yeah, disposal of dead rodents is quite a tricky one. It's always been tricky in pest control. I remember I had a drum in the back of my van, and I used to put them in there, seal the drum lid, and then get rid of them with my waste. So yeah, disposal of rodents is quite tricky, but just follow the product label. It'll say on the product label how best to dispose of them. I've used dried mealworm beetles on traps to capture bait shy mice. Yeah, good tip. Like I say, I've used just about everything. Chocolate used to work pretty well. I used to have a food site that you couldn't hardly use anything. because of risk of contamination and things like that. So that was quite tricky. Mayonnaise has been quite good. Breakfast cereal always works quite well. Yeah, any of them. I'm going a little bit over, but that's okay. Plenty of questions to go through. Natalie normally goes 10 minutes over, so I've still got 5 minutes to go. Done that one. So, due to the low secondary poisoning risk for cholecalciferol, shouldn't we be using this before traps, as the risk is less to non-targets? No, traps there's no risk to non-targets for secondary poisoning. It's low secondary poisoning risk with cholecalciferol. It doesn't say there isn't any, but it is lower. If it's appropriate for the site you're working on, it might not be appropriate to use cholecalciferol, which is why at the start of the hierarchy, this is very site specific, and some things will be appropriate, some won't be appropriate, and selecting that will be your breakdown when you're doing your site survey. Okay. Hi, best way of controlling mouse infestation in domestic dwelling with large flat complexes. Multiple buildings inside a large complex is always quite difficult. Trying to find routes, so things like cable trunking, if they have service ducting. So normally, if you've got like a floor of maybe 7 apartments, they might have a service duct, and running up that service duct will be all the cables and pipeworks and things. So you need to find where they're moving about. That's kind of the only way to do it. It's very difficult to proof individual buildings in like a flat complex, but finding that root cause. So how they got in and then finding where they're moving around the building, that normally can help in them situations. Them service ductings, I remember doing an office block, and the service ductings, every time I went, they just have mouse activity in them because they'd just be moving up and down the service duct in different part of the buildings. Can make it quite tricky. So yeah, finding them routes. Okay, I'm new to pest control, and recent jobs have been residential with 1 mouse spotted, carrying out basic survey, but any recommendations on how to deal with this scenario? Yeah, so if you've got 1 mice, it's very rare there is just one. It might be one that's just come in, but normally I remember I opened my kitchen door once in my house, and there was some mouse droppings in there. Thought, oh, it's probably just a mouse got in. I noticed it pretty quick, or what I thought I did. I can't remember them being there, recently before that. And so I put 5 or 6 traps in. When I came back the next day, just about all of them had mice in. So yeah, you may think there's just one. The chance are there's probably going to be more. But if they've got mice and they want you to deal with it, then yeah, go do your survey, pick a treatment that's applicable, and do it. Yeah, so this is a question, mainly more of a comment. It did say just a comment. I've been in the industry for over 27 years. Risk hierarchy is fundamentally important to the industry. However, trying to convince the property or business owner to adapt and spending money on things like proofing can be impossible sometimes. Yeah, totally agree. It's all about changing and changing how we manage them expectations of customers. And I think the change is happening, and it takes us just to keep going through that with customers and explaining why we need to do it this way. Just like when I'm not going to get on it too much, but when the general license changed, for instance, a couple of years ago, it was about adapting and speaking to the customers and just letting them know there was a bit of hardship. Same with rodent control. There's always a bit of hardship when things change, but hopefully in the long run, we come out the other side better off as an industry. So yeah, keep talking to them customers, keep managing them expectations. Is it right to add more dose of bait if the bot if the what? Is it right to add more dose of bait if the bait was eaten? Depending on the product you're using, if you've got activity, if it's a multi-feed, you need to keep that bait there. So yeah, if they're eating the bait, you can put more down. Just make sure you're removing what's been damaged and you don't exceed what it says on the product label. Then product labels are the main things. Follow that, and you'll do right with using rodenticides. Latest update on the use of glue boards. Has there been a movement with a bill going through Parliament? Last I heard, I think the bill was maybe at the second reading or at the reporting stage. So it's probably 2/3, 3/4 of the way through the first house. It then has to go through the House of Lords. So there's a bit to go on it. It did move quite quickly through a couple of stages. So they are pushing on with it. But yeah, it will be a little bit of time, I imagine, before anything solid comes out of it. And I think there's going to be like a 2-year lead-in period. So once the actual piece of legislation has been announced, there's then going to be a lead-in period for glue boards on the new licensing system and how that all looks, but that's all to be discussed. Squirrel traps. Placing squirrel traps. What are the return for follow-ups? Check them regular. If you are live trapping, obviously you need to check them daily. Twice a day is best, and make sure you're removing them. Obviously, grey squirrels you can't release, so you need to let your customers know that you need to get back to check the traps, and that you will need to dispatch them if they are caught. But if you're using fen traps, then yeah, just check them regular. What are the penalties for getting ERA wrong? What are the penalties for getting ERA wrong? Prosecution, if you get it really wrong. Yeah, tricky one. It's not happened. I don't know if it's happened yet. I've not heard anything if anyone's been brought up on it. It may be something that'll be like the next thing that's going to be looked at. Not sure. What are the penalties for getting it wrong? Yeah, don't know yet. We'll see. If you're not sure and you're not sure how to do them, give us a ring and I'll try and talk you through as best as possible. It is from anonymous, so I'm not sure who it's from. But yeah, if you want to talk about ERAs, let us know and I can point you in the right direction. Good tip for baits to use for traps for rats and mice. Anything that they're eating. When you do your site survey, look for what they're eating. That'll give you a real good indication of what products that you can use on your traps. I've been to sites where they're eating chocolate mousse, so he was using chocolate on the traps. I've been to sites where they're eating birdseed, so we removed all the birdseed that they could eat and just put some of that on the traps. That worked. If you're working in supermarkets or people's houses, look at what they're eating. It might be breakfast cereal. I've used porridge oats and things like that before. So yeah, whatever they're eating on that site, you could use in your trap. Just be mindful of allergens and things like that. Yeah, cdc.gov if you want more information on hantavirus. Thanks for that, Dean. Best way to avoid pesticide resistance. If you've got if you go on the Resistance Action Group website, there is a map and it tells you area where they've discovered resistance. Obviously, it needs a bit more work doing on it with updates and things. I think they did shut for like the COVID period, so I'm not sure at what stage they're at now. But there is a map on there, and it'll have different active ingredients and where there are levels of resistance. Yeah, just be mindful of it. If you're putting bait down, and you're still getting activity and they're still eating the bait, chances are you might have resistance. So you might need to change the active ingredient that you are using. Okay, if rodenticide is developed in an external environment but not immediately available to rodents due to mitigation controls, is it in use and should it be covered by an ERA? If rodenticide is applied in an external agreement but not immediately in use. Not sure on that one. Should it be covered by an ERA? If you're using rodenticides externally, you should have done an ERA. So any rodenticides using will be in that. Not really sure on that question. How good is anticoagulant foam that is approved for rats? Pretty good. I've used it quite a lot. Indoor use only. Can't use foam within 2 meters of food or stored food. Well, last time I read the product label, that was the case. If you're using it, read the product label. I'll say that over and over again. But is it good? Yeah, I've used it with good effect.
Hi, John.
Hello.
Time to wrap up.
Good. Okay, we've got a few left. I'll try and answer them. I did go over a little bit. I'll try and answer them and send it out shortly. Thanks for today. Like I say, Natalie is on next week. And if you're coming to PestX, I will see you there. Have a good day.